You're listening to The Higher Ed Marketer, a podcast geared towards marketing professionals in higher education. This show will tackle all sorts of questions related to student recruitment, donor relations, marketing trends, new technologies, and so much more. If you're looking for conversations centered around where the industry is going, this podcast is for you. Let's get into the show.
Welcome to the Higher Ed Marketer podcast, where every week we try to create wonderful and interesting conversations with higher ed marketers that we admire for the sake of other higher ed marketers to glean ideas from or just have something in common with. I'm always joined with my co-host, Bart Kaler, and we are talking to James Steen, and he's with Houston Baptist University, and he is going to give us some wonderful tidbits on a transition that they made here recently. Bart, if you can help me explain a little bit about James and what they're doing.
Yeah, I think we're going to have a great conversation with James, and I met James a number of years ago at a Council for Christian Colleges and Universities meeting in Tampa Bay. And he and I hit it off well and had a chance to kind of get to know each other a little bit better. And I've kind of followed him for a couple of years on what he's been doing, and it's been fascinating. I think he's an excellent leader and really kind of looked up to several of his peers, and especially in faith-based Christian higher education. And I know that recently he spoke at a conference that I spoke with NACAP. And so it was great to be a part of that with him. But he's done some very innovative things during his time at HBU, and it plays out into higher enrollment numbers. And so I really like the fact that sometimes doing innovative things and making what might be hard decisions sometimes can really pay off and really, in the long run, create a momentum that you can really ride for a while. And one of the conversations that we'll talk about today is the idea of this whole test optional, whether or not you need an ACT or an SAT score to come to college. It's controversial. There's been a lot of conversation on Inside Higher Ed and other industry publications about different aspects of test optional, as far as, from a racial equality and diversity standpoint to just a pragmatic standpoint within the pandemic. And I think it's interesting to hear James talk about his journey on that thought process and the decisions that HBU made this year as it related to that, and how HBU is a kind of an interesting place as far as diversity too. So it's going to be some really good conversations to hear from James.
Yes, he's a smart individual and a very engaging conversationalist. And it's time for us to bring him into the conversation. We're excited to welcome James Steen, Vice President of Enrollment Management at Houston Baptist University, to the show. Welcome, James.
Thank you so much for having me, Troy. I appreciate it.
James, if you could please tell us about your role at Houston Baptist.
Absolutely. So I've been at Houston Baptist University for almost 15 years now. And before that, I was at Baylor University for a little over 13 years. And I describe myself as basically a recovering admissions counselor. I started way back when, right out of college. I was a tour guide whenever I was a student at Baylor and would drop families off over at the admissions office. So when I was graduating and had no idea what I was going to do after graduation, I thought I could get one of those admissions counselor jobs and do that for a year or two and then go get a real job, right? So 28 years later, here I am, and I'm still a recovering admissions counselor.
That's great. James, I don't think I've ever met a small girl or boy who says, I want to be a vice president for enrollment when I grow up sometimes. So
Exactly.
It's not one of those jobs that you start and you say, that's my career path, but
no,
that's exciting.
It's definitely not on the top 10 list, is it?
So, when we first kind of started talking a little bit about this podcast, James, I know you and I have known each other for a few years, and we reached out to you and said, hey, let's kind of talk a little bit about what's going on at Houston Baptist. And in the pre-interview, you kind of talked about a number of things, but one of the interesting topics that I found, especially in light of what's happened in the last year, 18 months with COVID and the pandemic, is just this journey and maybe the success that Houston Baptist has after you made the decision to go test optional. And I know a lot of people are aware of that. I'd just like to talk a little bit about that because, I mean, we have a lot of different people on the listening to the show. Some people might totally understand what's going on, why you made that choice. Other people might be like, what's test optional? Tell us a little bit about what went into that topic, when it went into that decision for HBU and where you guys are on that.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. That's a good question. And I know I'll qualify my stance on test optional by saying, probably 5 or 6 years ago, I wrote a paper when I was working on my doctorate just about the whole test optional process in general. And I really took the stance in that paper arguing that it's not necessarily the problem is not necessarily with the test as much as it is with our admissions policies, right? So whereas the SAT or the ACT, certainly standardized testing, is certainly biased in favor of some versus others, as long as the stance I took was as long as we as enrollment managers, as directors of admission, as long as we're able to have policies that are fair and equitable. It's not necessarily the test that's the problem. So that was the argument that I took several years ago. So I didn't necessarily go into the pandemic or go into 2020 with this whole mindset that test optional was going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. But I'm coming out of this crazy COVID year that we've had really as a convert, if you will, to test optional. And I think for us, for HBU especially, it really has been a game changer. And I'll also say too, we're HBU, Houston Baptist University, is a really unique institution. It's not your typical private or Baptist university. We're majority Hispanic with well over 43% of our freshmen are Hispanic. We're about 22% African American. We're about 20% white and even, 10 to 12% Asian. So it's a really, really diverse institution. So we didn't necessarily need to go test optional to help more students of color access HBU. That was not the impetus. We really made that switch because we had to. Literally, students were not able to take standardized tests. They did not have SAT or ACT scores readily available. So we really just did it as a strategic decision, much like everybody else did. And I know we can dig into the numbers a little bit further, but I would say for us at HBU, it really, really has been a game changer.
That's great. And I guess just out of curiosity, since we're talking to a lot of marketers on this podcast, how did you end up kind of communicating that and really kind of selling that as a benefit for HBU? Because, I mean, not everybody's doing that. And certainly there's various reasons why people might go test optional. I mean, certainly a lot of it's the right thing to do as far as diversity and accessibility for different groups. But I think that, the pandemic caused some things, but how did you end up kind of communicating that and how did that become part of the marketing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. We, from our perspective, as you said, we didn't necessarily go into it trying to increase our diversity. And I will say there are very legitimate reasons to do that. I know a lot of institutions have had success doing that even prior to the pandemic. And I think it's important, to note as well on the back end that institutions that go test optional, their mean SAT or mean ACT goes up, right? Because those with lower test scores tend not to self-report. Those with higher test scores do continue to provide test scores and go that route, if you will. And we've seen all of those things happen at HBU this year as well. But I think we really went into it with the message that we understand what you're going through. We understand that there are problems and issues. There's limited access to standardized testing. And so we want to do whatever we can to make HBU and this admissions process as accessible to you as possible. And quite frankly, I think the marketing of test optional in a lot of ways has almost become ubiquitous. So I don't know many institutions who have really, planted a stake in the ground and said, we're not budging. This is our policy come hell or high water. I think really all of us, at least every enrollment manager that I know, had to make some hard decisions or change their processes in terms of test optional, in terms of how to get this 2021 class in the door. So I don't want to say it sold itself, but it certainly was not a hard sell, if you will, from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, that's great. And from what I understand, what you've said is that it was not an impediment to building your class. And I think that's probably an important thing, is that sometimes when we're looking at these things, trying to make decisions about how things move forward, it's like, what's going to hurt you versus what could help you if you moved those things.
Exactly. And I think in doing that, we've now, in some ways, created an expectation, at least externally, that this is going to be the new norm. And I think it'll be interesting to see over the next several years how many institutions go back to requiring an SAT or an ACT, how many institutions continue to have test optional as one of their admissions policies. And I think not to speak for the administration at Houston Baptist University, I think for the short run, we are very happy remaining test optional. And I think there's even, several more ways to leverage that in the future.
If I recall correctly in our earlier conversation, test optional, certainly, as you said, the higher scores tend to self-report. You still require scores for merit awards. Is that correct?
That is not correct. So
okay.
We actually, so we started the year, with this big question mark of, okay, what are we going to do about those who are admitted under test optional that don't have a test score? Because obviously merit awards were so integral to that process. So we literally came up with an entirely new process for awarding merit. And I'll be honest, it was a little touch and go. We certainly ran numbers. We worked with R&L to come up with, a formulation for our scholarship and merit awarding that we thought could work with test optional. And in doing that, the tricky thing was our acceptance letters actually double as a scholarship or merit award. So it's, congratulations, Bart, you're accepted to Houston Baptist University and you've been awarded the XYZ scholarship. So we couldn't even get an acceptance letter out until we figured this process out. And the interesting thing is we did have some tweaks along the way with the formula that we were using for test optional. But in the grand scheme of things, if you think of your admit pool as kind of a bell curve with those at the top and the bottom, and then everybody in the middle kind of forming a nice, pretty bell curve. So far, we'll see what it looks like once we get to census date and how the final yield comes in. But so far, we've been able to maintain that nice, pretty bell curve, if you will, even with our merit award distribution. So that was something at the beginning of the year I would have told you there's no way we can do a merit award without a test score, right? But we've been able to even pivot and figure out a way to do that going forward.
That's great. And then I guess one final question about the test optional before we move on. Is there any place in the funnel that you saw a greater increase in results because of this new approach? I mean, was it the applications? Was it the admits? Was it the deposits? I mean, where in the funnel did that kind of play itself out?
Yeah, so I think that was the thing that was the most exciting and the biggest surprise to us. So at the top of the funnel, for those who don't know the funnel, you've got your inquiries and your applicants. So our inquiries and applicants year over year were down about 7%. So when your applications are down 7%, you certainly don't expect to be up at the bottom of the funnel. However, because of test optional, our application completion rate is literally up year over year about 10 points better. So we're able to complete more applications, even though we had fewer of them, and my acceptance rate, I was able to accept more. So my acceptance rate year over year is up about 10 points. So you do the compounding of that. So even though we're down on applications, I'm able to complete more and admit more at a higher rate because of test optional. So we literally have 27% more admits this year than we did last year. And currently at the bottom of the funnel, we're sitting on 24% more deposits this year versus last year. And I think the exciting thing is a lot of us, I think, and I was just on an EAB call the other day, and about 2% nationally, of all institutions, their data was showing that deposits were up nationally about 2%. And that's as compared to last year. Well, a lot of us were down on deposits last year. So really, if you go back to 2019 and compare this year versus 2019, we're still up on deposits. And because of, I'm literally giving credit to this new test optional policy. Because of this new test optional policy, we're going to enroll far and away a record number of freshmen this fall, which of course we're thrilled about.
Well, congratulations on that. And I guess one of the takeaways that I'm listening to from a marketing standpoint, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but would you say that the test optional decision, obviously there's a lot of things that went into that, but you removed one piece of friction for a student being able to get enrolled to Houston Baptist University. I often talk to my clients and people about removing friction from the students' engagement. Whether we on the RFI form, if we're asking way too many questions and they just decide I can't complete this is crazy. Anywhere we can remove friction, it helps kind of smooth it and keep it forward. It sounds to me like there's a lot of factors involved, but maybe there was a little bit of friction in that, I've got to gather my scores. I've got to gather everything for my application. Do you think that maybe that was part of what increased your application completion rate?
Yeah. I think it's all of the above. And we're even, good marketers are obviously good about doing research and market analysis. We're trying to do a survey of this incoming class to really understand the why behind some of these numbers and some of these metrics that we're experiencing. But I do think as enrollment managers, and you use the word friction, I use the word barriers. I think we have to be very intentional about removing barriers, right? And so the argument to be made is, if you don't have to have an application fee, then why do you have one? Or one of my mentors, Bill Royal, used to say the only reason to have an application fee is if you're willing to waive it, right? And I think there are really good reasons to have an application fee, but if you don't have to have an application fee, do you really, should you have one? It becomes a barrier to entry, right? So you can ask those things about every different stage of the funnel, and certainly in the application process. If you don't have to require a test score, then should you? And I think especially after experiencing just some of the incredible success that we've had this year, I think the answer for us is no, we don't have to do that. And I think if we're going to do it, we're going to go all in. And one of the things that we're looking at even for next year is this idea of do no harm. And if an applicant comes in and maybe checks I want to go traditional route or checks the test optional route, if for some reason they submit a test score and maybe they're not admissible with that test score, but they would be admissible under a test optional review process, or the other scenario could be, or what if a student who comes in on the traditional route maybe would qualify for a lower scholarship than they would if they were test optional, right? So a do no harm policy would say it doesn't matter what methodology you choose. Right. When you apply, we're gonna do no harm, right? We're gonna give you the benefit of the doubt, and if it's best for you to go the traditional route, or if it's best for you to go test optional, that's how we're going to consider you for admission and or award your merit scholarship. So I think that's how we're researching and really looking into how to make this even better going forward next year.
That's great. And I liked what you said about, what Royal said about the idea of if you don't need a fee, don't charge one. I'm sure though that some people on campus, when it comes to test optional, especially academics and faculty, would say, actually, that is something that's required. It's something that we need because,
Yes.
for whatever reason, they have their belief. How did you deal with that? Because I'm sure that came up.
It did. And I think, and just talking to colleagues, in different areas of the country and at other institutions, it is so true. I think that, if faculty want to know that the students they're teaching in the classroom are qualified to be there. And I think we had to do a lot of homework with data in terms of looking at studies and research that showed really GPA and high school rank and these other metrics that we can get from a high school transcript that's literally based on 3 or 4 years as opposed to a standardized test score that's based on 3 or 4 hours, truly is a better predictor. So when we made the decision to go test optional, we had to sell it or market it externally, but we also had to sell it internally too.
Yeah.
And convince faculty that this student that we're considering through this new holistic review process really is not only going to be a good fit, but is going to be a contributor, is going to be successful in the classroom. So it really is kind of a both and approach. We had to market it externally, but we did have to do some work internally to convince faculty. And again, we'll know when it comes to fall, spring, what our fall to spring retention is. And we're going to be very, very methodical about going through the data and making sure the decisions that we made were the right ones.
That's fascinating. That's great. And I love the fact that it takes internal marketing sometimes as much as it takes external. So I want to pivot really quick before we kind of close up and everything and just talk a little bit. At the very beginning, you talked about HBU and some of the diversity issues. And I just wanted to kind of touch base on that because I think that, it's naturally occurred on your campus with diversity because of your location. And, but I think that many schools struggle to build diversity. And, and we've talked to a couple of different guests about that. And I've been in situations where, people have actually said, can you do some marketing so that we have more diverse students come in? And I look at their, staff and faculty page and I'm like, well, you probably need to have more people who are diverse on your staff before you actually can market more people. Because that's what they're going to look for. That's what anybody's going to look for is, am I going to fit in here? And if they go to your website and they don't see that they're going to fit in, I don't care how much marketing that I do. I'm just curious what you think about that. Certainly you've been naturally blessed to have that where you are. And I think it brings a richness to the community, but tell me about, what your advice is.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely correct, Bart, and you've hit the nail on the head that it really does matter who we hire, and I really we don't have a specific metric that we're trying to hit in terms of hiring policies, but I do have a very diverse team working for me, and so when prospective students come to campus, when they go to our admissions page, when they're visiting, they see lots of students of color, and they see admissions counselors from many different backgrounds, and so it's sometimes it's a challenge, right, to really try to connect with everybody and find that institutional fit with everybody. But I think it absolutely begins with and hiring, your hiring policies are so critical.
That's great. I'm glad that you shared that with us and that's what you've found as well. So great.
James, you've been so generous with your wisdom, but Bart and I are greedy. And every week we ask our guest, if there's an additional idea or something that you've come across that would be an idea worth sharing to your colleagues that may be listening to the show, if you could share that, please, and anything that's top of mind. Yeah,
absolutely. Thanks, Troy. I think one of the things that, this COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has taught us more than anything, and I think this is true for all of us, in a sense, is that we have to fly the plane. And I'm kind of borrowing that quote from the movie Sully. And, it's hard to go wrong with a Clint Eastwood directed movie that Tom Hanks is starring in, right? It's just hard to go wrong with a movie like that. And it's a true story. But when everything is blowing up, when everything is going wrong, you still have to fly the plane, right? And I think that's true for all of us, whether we're enrollment managers, whether we're, chief academic officers, whether we're chief financial officers, whether we're in marketing or wherever we are. During a pandemic, we still have to fly the plane, right? During a hurricane, we've had 2 hurricanes at HBU since I've been here. We still have to fly the plane, right? We may be underwater, we may be without power, we may be all Zooming from home and having to figure out how to do things virtually. But ultimately, we're still called to do everything that we're supposed to do. And so regardless of what's happening, we still have to figure out how to fly the plane.
James, that's wonderful and brilliant. And you did a great job of bringing this episode down for a landing. Thank you so much. If someone would like to reach you, what's the best way for them to do so?
Absolutely. You can ping me or connect on LinkedIn. You can certainly shoot me an email it's just first initial, last name, J. Steen at hbu.edu. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, James. Bart, before we depart, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I really appreciate everything you said, James. And sometimes I like to just kind of summarize a couple key points for everyone to kind of think about. I think that a lot of what James talked about, and one of the key points I wanted to kind of point out is that a lot of times when you're making decisions and making change, removing the barriers and then being able to communicate that to the prospective students is very important. I think marketing that and explaining that sometimes. I'm a big believer that even if you're, on your application page or even as you're getting ready to start the application, explain to them what they're getting ready to do. Explain to them how it's going to work. Remove any barriers of them wanting to just jump because they're overwhelmed. But I think the other thing that I really wanted to point out is that just how HBU really took and had to do some internal marketing. And I think sometimes we forget about that. I think that we're so busy and focused as marketers, and sometimes we're in small offices where we don't have, we're overwhelmed already with the amount of work that we need to do. But I think that sometimes when big major changes are happening, especially in the enrollment office, being able to communicate that internally will save a lot of political headache and heartache later on. And so I think it's so important to kind of think about how do we make sure that our messaging is going both ways, both internally and externally. So I really appreciate, you pointing that out, James. And that's just kind of a key takeaway I want everybody to think about.
Absolutely.
Well said, Bart. And thank you both for a wonderful episode. To all of our listeners, we just want to remind you that the Higher Ed Marketer podcast is sponsored by Kaler Solutions, an education, marketing, and branding agency, and by Think Patented, a marketing execution, printing, and mailing provider of higher ed solutions. On behalf of the co-host Bart Kaler, I'm Troy Singer. Thank you for joining us.
You've been listening to The Higher Ed Marketer. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast player. If you're listening with Apple Podcasts, we'd love for you to leave a quick rating of the show. Simply tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. Until next time.